2021 was probably the year that I finished more games than any other since childhood, maybe ever. Between new stuff and replays, I had this previously unheard of motivation to play things one after the other, rather than sitting about doing nothing or passing the day away on YouTube and Discord as usual. After the utter shit show that was 2020 for everyone, I just kinda needed a distraction as to not wallow in the state of things for a second year running while trapped in the house. In a weird way, just shutting my brain off to play games constantly like I did when I was younger was quite therapeutic. I'm going to talk about some of the games I finished for the first time last year in a few bonus categories. I won't be discussing outright spoilers, but some things might contextually be spoilers. I'll try to keep footage as safe as possible. This will be the first video of mine to be public, so let's hope I don't get slammed too badly. Let's get into it. I already did a full video last year about the game I was playing as it became 2021, Dragon Quest XI, so I'll kick off this video with the first game I started in 2021 proper, which was Control. This was one of my backlog shames since I love Alan Wake and the original Max Payne game so much. It just came out a period in time where I wasn't actually playing that many games and I was saving up all my spare cash for a trip to Japan. I'm sure that 40 quid was better spent getting my dick kicked in Tekken and Akihabara anyway. Probably. Thankfully, I went into the game blind. All I knew about it was that posts of the fall were back in it, which is pretty typical for a Remedy game. When I started it, I wasn't actually that sure about it. I couldn't help but think about how unpolished some of it felt, and how Jessie acted like some sort of weirdo disconnected from reality. She made York from Deadly Premonition look like an average salaryman, and I was constantly getting lost. That last point is on me in fairness. I've got a really terrible sense of direction in games, but the map itself was also quite bad. After those first few hours though, things began clicking for me. When Jessie's powers were becoming more readily available, it actually became quite a joy to traverse the oldest house, levitating about the place, chucking stationery and printers at the hiss, which are like the possessed creepy remnants of your former would-be colleagues. I mentioned Deadly Premonition earlier, and another thing it has in common alongside unhinged protagonists and otherworld people is that the side quests, while optional, a lot of them tie into the world building of the game and were fully voice acted. It felt like a nice reward for exploring. Several of them were quite well hidden, you could quite easily miss them altogether. An entire quest line is hidden off in like this underground area submerged in corrupted plant life that you would never actually have to visit during the main plot. Not only did they add some development to Jessie and the lore of the oldest house, it elaborated on its own shared universe with other Remedy titles which I relished. A particular standout was one that established Alan Wake's weird optional thermos collecting obsession as a canon event that special agents witnessed and had to report on to the agency. One memorable moment from the optional content was coming across this guy guarding a fridge, and he explodes upon looking away from it. You can enter the fridge itself and then you end up fighting a being called the Former, which is this like kaiju-sized interdimensional horror. The bosses in the game are never particularly difficult, but they make good use of all of Jessie's powers, so I always found them quite satisfying regardless. I wouldn't really recommend doing every side quest like I did though. As cool as some of them were towards the end, many of them just became busy work where you're essentially just fetch questing. One particular one that really annoyed me was in the otherwise fantastic Alan Wake DLC, where you have to search for stuff in a section of the oldest house that's covered in darkness. Darkness itself is obviously a key factor in the lore and horror of Alan Wake, but it didn't really make it any less frustrating being unable to find anything because it was just simply too dark. Another tedious questline was watering plants and scrubbing mould off of walls in obscure places. On top of it being repetitive, the rewards just simply weren't worth justifying the time and effort. You could get better mods for Jessie's abilities and weapons off the common enemies that you would be fighting in the main story anyway. I eventually came to like Jessie a lot. She's a weirdo undoubtedly, but she just comes off as awkward more than anything, but that eventually became quite endearing. During one of the best moments of the game, the ashtray maze, her reaction to the events unfold perfectly matched my sentiment. I said that was awesome, and so did she in the game a moment later. It's a moment that everyone else I know who's played the game also loves. The story was interesting too, although I found the ending quite abrupt. Thankfully the game had some post-game story quests and a post-game DLC to solve that issue, so I don't really mind too much, but I think it would have bothered me had I not played the Ultimate Edition. Before I move on, I'll touch on one thing that genuinely really impressed me about the game, and that was the destruction in physics. As Jesse's always lobbing stuff around with his psychokinesis, things would get broken up and destroyed, be it debris, cobblestone, office equipment, bodies, or just whatever. I remember ripping off a chunk of the wall in one of the rooms near the safe zone to attack a hiss near the start of the game, and I thought nothing of it. But then when I came back about 20 hours later, that environment was still the same. It hadn't reset. I had thought for sure that it would just default to normal when I loaded into a different area or turned the game off, but it kept everything in its destroyed state. It's easy to become jaded about games as a medium now, especially when it's only really graphical improvements being made as generations pass, but it was one of those rare occasions where I was just like, whoa, that's really cool. Even bigger budget games will zone out destruction or corpses to not tank the frame rate or processing, but Control managed it beautifully. Beyond that, I'm just glad that Alan Wake 2 is happening. I'll thank Jessie for her hand in that in the DLC. In last year's video, I rambled on about how much Persona 5 Royal renewed my faith in Persona in general, as well as my surprise at how much I enjoyed Persona Q2 in 2019. However, when these three games were announced, Strikers was without a doubt the one I was most excited about. My tepid reaction to Persona 5's vanilla release being the key factor in dismissing an expanded port in Royal, and Q2 was the sequel to a game that I liked but didn't particularly love, because it came out in that weird Persona 4 era where characters were beginning to be reduced to one core defining character trait, as if it was Danganronpa or something. The Persona themed Musou title though, for me, as a long-time Dynasty Warriors enthusiast, / apologist depending on who you ask, was absolutely ideal. So did it live up to the hype? Well, sorta. I'll iterate first and say that it's in the Musou mold, but it's not actually one. I'd say it's more of an action RPG hybrid. One of my favourite things about Royal was how it recontextualised all the characters in its final arc until its conclusion. For example, I went from thinking that Akechi was a joke to enjoying his weird rabid Chunibyo energy, and many of the story beats regarding Maruki and Kasumi reminded me of the original Persona. It had shades of the Deva Yuga system, and particularly the fantastic manga adaptation, which if you're a fan of the series or you just can't be arsed playing it, is a fantastic interpretation of the source material that you should read. Royal's end wasn't as optimistic as Vanilla's conclusion, but I feel that it made the core cast extend their character arcs in a satisfying way beyond their confidant. That said, because of Atlus's inability to plan and devise multiple projects without consultations, we're in this weird nebulous zone where devs are saying that Royal and Strikers are in different continuities. I'm sure later inevitable spin-offs will incorporate both, like was the case with Marie and Theodore in Automax, or Katone in Q2, despite its non-canon status. We're now at a stage where these characters have regressed a little, and I'm not sure how I feel. I won't go too heavily into the narrative because I don't want to spoil it, but it just leaves me in two minds. Part of me is happy with the copious amounts of fan service in Strikers. I enjoy the Persona 5 cast. I like seeing them interact in these more slice-of-life oriented scenes. I never was one of those people complaining about the lack of them in the core game, because I felt Persona 4 maybe leaned a bit too hard into them at some point, especially in Golden, but I appreciated them just letting them enjoy themselves. The interactions are fun, and bouncing about Japan allows for a nice sense of flow that the calendar system might not afford. I enjoyed the newly introduced characters of Zenkichi and Sophie too. I think they play quite well off of the Phantom Thieves. I appreciate how they introduced arc villains for the most part, that are parallel to the protagonists. They're nothing to write home about, but they're a cut above some of the more comedically evil villains that appear in Persona 5. That said, the other part of my brain cannot go over the nuance that was robbed of the characters from Annul and Royal. I feel like, without that and their original narrative arcs concluded, they just kind of meander through the game without any real issue. It is very much a fluff game where characters safely stay the same, starting and ending in the same status quo. The story, while serviceable, I can't help but boil it down to, dude, maybe phones are bad lol, in the end. On the gameplay side of things, I liked how each Phantom Thief had a unique battle style. It was a welcome reprieve after the abysmal Dynasty Warriors 9 broke me with its awful new battle system and 99% clone roster. Even Fire Emblem Warriors, which was quite good despite its roster, had an alarming amount of clones in it. Not here though, every character had their own dynamic style and seemed to quite nicely integrate from the RPG. I really enjoyed Yusuke, Haru and Anne in particular. Yusuke had a little Virgil Jr. vibe to him that I appreciated, and it made him really fun to play especially. And Haru reminded me of Lissa in Fire Emblem Warriors. I was never really a fan of Jiao Chan's whip in Dynasty Warriors, but Anne somehow made it work. I think in order to make them stand out, the two newer characters are vastly more useful overall in the endgame, which led to characters like Morgana and Makoto, for me personally, trailing a bit behind everyone else, who I would alternate in regularly. I kinda wish Makoto was more bike oriented in general, as to provide a more unique niche, but that's such a minor issue, she was fun anyway. I'm not sure if it's on the Persona side or the Koei side, but I found the game pretty easy and imbalanced. For the first dungeon I was under the assumption it worked like the RPGs and I couldn't leave the dungeon to recover my SP without consuming free time in the calendar, so I did a large amount of it in low SP try to push on to the best of my abilities. When I found out my progress to effort ratio was becoming too slow, I jumped out of the metaverse back to Shibuya only to discover no time had passed at all. I could just restock from the Vendies, go on Amazon, cook up some pakora and then head back in without any penalty for the rest of the game. Beyond limiting yourself for a challenge, this completely destroys any sort of balance the game has. I'm never one to complain about difficulty, but that combined with the extremely generous checkpoint system meant that there was never really any consequence to spamming your biggest bollocks elemental spell constantly for 5 minutes, then bouncing back out for a quick blow behind the bleachers with your waifu or husbando of choice, and then just popping back in. While Fusion Calculation and the Velvet Room are Cathedral of Shadows certainly as prone to making broken Persona or demons in the core games, I felt it was even more lenient here. Sacrificing stuff and creating broken personas seemed easier than ever. I didn't even need to create a deranged flowchart of skills and mythical beings that I'd be fusing into a moth in like 20 turns. It was just like, here you go, here's a 99 strength persona for no real work. Thanks, I guess? I'm not really sure how this affects the Big Dick G mode you unlock when you complete the game, but I can't even imagine that mode is going to be much in the face of a fully stat capped persona, especially when Gimps just use Yoshitsune anyway. Overall, I had a lot of fun with the game and I liked returning to that cast and setting, but it felt quite inconsequential overall. It'll be on PlayStation Plus this month as of recalling, so definitely give it a go if you like Persona 5 or Musou likes. I'm pretty infamously not a fan of Resident Evil 7, despite it being incredibly well regarded by virtually everyone else, be it Devil Buster or the internet as a whole. I've always chalked it down to people settling for mediocrity because they all hated Resident Evil 6 so much that anything without explosions or QTEs was mind-blowing to them. That said, I did replay 7 beforehand and I was going to give Village a fair unbiased playthrough because I've been a massive fan of Resident Evil since its inception. One of my major hang-ups on the last game was the level and enemy design. I felt it was extremely lacking outside of Jack Baker. So when trailers had these bombastic over-the-top village leads like Booba Lady, Big Lebowski and the werewolves being shown off, I was really excited. And honestly, getting into Village I was having a great time. Running away from the werewolves, exploring Mummy Milker's castle, even the dollhouse. I was about to give Capcom some credit here. I think the magic immediately wore off after the point I got to Fishman's Wild Adventure though. I began to sour in the game's over-reliance on cutscenes and scripted set pieces. It was something I took ire with in Resident Evil 7 and especially Resident Evil 3 Remake. Like Resident Evil 3 Remake, it dawned on me that some of the things I was enjoying before, like the exploration, treasure seeking, the cooking, it was something that was only really applicable to the first 40 minutes of the game. Between the water section and Lebowski's meme fortress, I was growing rapidly more tired. The game was only 7 hours long, but I was beginning to wish it had copied Resident Evil 3 Remake outright and only lasted 3. To put it another way, Village feels to me like Resident Evil 6 Mark II, although I love Resident Evil 6, and certainly not this one. By that, I mean it tries too hard to place too many demographics of Resident Evil fans. Every Patriarch's area feels like it encapsulates an era of Resident Evil without the actual charm of the source. Booba Lady feels like it was made for those who jumped in at the brilliant Resident Evil 2 remake. Squidward feels like a blatant callback to Resident Evil 4's excellent Chapter 1 ending, but without an ounce of the charm, and Heisenberg's is reminiscent of 7, being bored in an industrial complex. Beyond that, I felt the weapons had no real kick. Nothing really felt satisfying to use. There was no dilemma about what to use like you would feel from 1 to 5. There's no Blacktail versus Red 9 debate here. Despite that, everything recoils for about 20 seconds, so you have enough time to go and grab a cold one out of the fridge, get some ice, pour it to perfection, get your coaster, take that amazing first sip and finish it off, and then just kill the enemy. It's just so weirdly lenient on both controller and keyboard and mouse. Before I wrap up this section, I just want to give special mention to how Ethan continued to be the most asinine protagonist in the series. Although this time, instead of groaning uncontrollably, he became more of this unintentionally hilarious figure. His reactions, the way he interacts with people, everything, they just aren't normal, and it gave it this weird comedy vibe where I could imagine everyone looking at the camera after all of his one-liners or delayed remarks like it was The Office or Parks and Recreation. I never thought these games would get localised a few years ago. I guess in my mind I thought they had a better shot than Chaos Head and Noir, but it just didn't seem likely. I was so excited that not only did the first game, Elite, get announced for localisation, but the sequel, or Fandis depending on who you ask, was combined with it. By the time of release, I was a little disappointed to hear that the official localisation was kinda spotty, especially in the first game, so I waited a bit for the Committee of Zero fan patch and then get down to business. I was feeling kinda depressed honestly around the time of playing the first Robotics notes. Lockdown blues were returning and I was just sleeping a lot. If you've played any other science adventure games or watched the anime adaptations, you know they typically start off fairly slice of life before descending into a conspiracy or supernatural angle, but this is where Robotics notes sort of differs and stands out from its contemporaries. These elements are present of course, but the game is a lot more light-hearted overall. It really was comfy and it helped my mood immensely. I'd say this is thanks to many factors. Tanegashima as a setting is so much more welcoming to the cast. It's such a comfortable small island vibe where everyone knows everyone, compared to the extremely cold portrayal of Shibuya from the Chaos entries where no one seemingly cares about the well-being of the protagonists at the apex of their suffering, instead relishing in it. Another big part is one of the dual protagonists, Akiho. She's so incredibly optimistic and upbeat, almost infectiously so. She interacts with everyone with the same high energy, isn't ashamed to be herself, is passionate and has a clear dream to follow her sister's path and build a fully operational giant robot by the time she graduates high school. Everyone she comes into contact with can't help but be dragged into her dreams, and while many appear openly hesitant about it, it's clear they care for her. The Robotics Club in the story initially only has 2 members, Akiho and the other protagonist Kaito, who is indifferent to the goal of building a robot but cares enough about Akiho to at least give a degree of moral support. When the club expands with Juna, Subaru and eventually Frau, they all have such a great chemistry. In Steins Gate, I felt like the core cast were friends, but they were primarily through Okabe or Mayuri. Chaos Head's Takumi was always isolated, and there was an undercurrent of tension in the club and Chaos Child. But I could honestly see all these characters being able to hang out together without the crutch of a third wheel. I found myself really attached to these characters and I was always excited to get back onto the game at night when I'd finished doing everything else. While Persona 4 has never been my favourite entry of Megami Tensei or even Persona itself, it reminded me of that really chill atmosphere and the dynamic of the investigation team in Inaba as a setting. It was just a nice positive game to enjoy, with the intrigue and core drama only really ramping up towards the end. I don't want to spoil the nature of the last arc or ending, but all I'll say is it was an incredibly satisfying experience because you had spent so much time with these guys. To see them overcome the trials and tribulations and never losing that sense of familiarity and hope was kinda something I needed at the time of playing. I'll touch upon Dash as a sequel briefly since it's harder to talk about a visual novel sequel without spoiling the original. I liked Daru from Steins Gate and I was happy to see him return for this, sharing a dual protagonist role with Kaito. That said, I think if you hated Daru before, which I know my friends Daryl and Riff do, he's not going to do anything to change your mind here. With his inclusion though came something that wasn't really a thing in the original game, which was fan service. In Chaos Head and Chaos Child, the protagonists have the delusion trigger system, and they frequently imagine themselves in risky situations with the girls, but it's always confined to their minds. Robotics Notes Elite, however, a small scene with Nai aside, didn't really sexualise its characters at all, which changed dramatically in Dash. Now there was plenty of fetish wear, horny delusions, beach scenes and more. I'm not really averse to fan service honestly, but something about this just struck me as off-putting. I think it's because I was so pleasantly surprised how free of it the first game was. It made it all the more, maybe not distasteful per se, but just weird. It's a sad part of the medium, I suppose. I did love all the Steins Gate references though. It made me excited for the chance of a proper crossover in the future. Kurisu, Okabe and Daru are already familiar with the Chaos casts, so just make it happen, Chio. Before I move on, I just want to talk about the other protagonists of both games and the person your perspective is most often with, Kaito. I spoke about Akiho's optimism earlier on, but it'd be remiss of me not to share my thoughts on him, and I love him as a character as well. For many years, many people dismissed him as a, well, I'm a gamer type of character, because the anime adaptation annexes a lot of his personality in the transition. I felt this was also kind of the case in Steins Gate, but Kaito has it a lot rougher than Okabe, and the less said about the Chaos anime output, the better. Kaito to me is incredibly interesting as both a counterpoint to the other science adventure leads and his co-protagonist. While Akiho is an absolute ray of sunshine, Kaito is more subdued and introspective. Through the course of the series, every protagonist has been depressed or has some sort of mental hang-up. Chaos Head's Takumi is full of self-hatred. This lack of self-worth means he intentionally tries to, in his own words, appear as heir to others, to simply not be. Steins Gate's Okabe is lonely, and he believes he has to be the bombastic Hoi and Kyoma to both cheer up Mayuri, but also uses this to cover up his own insecurities. If people react poorly to him, it's the construct of a character created, not the man Okabe Rintaro. Chaos Child's Takuru is incredibly self-absorbed, believing himself to be better than everyone else. His boredom and arrogance in attempting to solve a serial murder case to earn the same level of fame and respect he mistakenly believes Nishijiro Takumi to have achieved at the climax of Chaos Head ends up being his undoing. Where does this leave Kaito though? Nowhere really. In a game about reaching and never giving up your dreams, he simply just doesn't have one. You find out that once he did wish to become an astronaut, but simply dismissed it as being unachievable. Other science adventure protagonists are otaku passing with varying levels of self-esteem issues, but Kaito is considerably well adjusted and pretty normie all things considered. The otaku traits are passed as fellow club members instead, all obsessed with mecha anime in some sort of way. He has no trouble talking to people regardless of status. He's incredibly self-confident in his abilities as a fighting game player, is savvy enough to uncover conspiracies that require mental and physical fortitude, he's overly opinionated, he taunts people, and he's capable of openly flirting and going on dates. He's the Ryuju his fellow protagonists hate. And yet, like the Okabe of Steins Gate Zero, just because he's functional in a conventional sense doesn't mean there isn't anything underneath the surface. Kaito's PTSD from an event in his childhood and his experience in general manifest in apathy, of acceptance. I mentioned earlier that he's a lot more introspective. He's not outwardly miserable, he just simply acts apathetic, both naturally and as a deterrent of other people's expectations of him. He's at an age where so many societal norms are being forced on him to achieve, to succeed, when he just simply doesn't have the drive or ambition. Those dreams have been sapped out of him. He's quite happy to let life pass him by, indifferent about what the future may hold. He's self-aware of this, of course, and intentionally uses it to deflect any expectations of him in his daily life, and as such, many of his fellow students think he's a bit of an arsehole. His parents worry about his future as well. Under the surface though is an empathetic young man with a good head on his shoulders. He would never admit it, but he cares deeply about his friends and always tries his best to help them succeed, even if he does it in secret to keep up the pretense of indifference. He is observant of everyone around him and he's always there for them, pushing him towards his dreams even if he himself lacks one. Akio might have brought the group together, but he's the anchor supporting everyone with quiet passion. In a few ways, it reminds me of Inoue Takumi from Kamen Rider Faiz, who provides a similar sort of role. Kaido's depression, reattainment of his dreams, and his character development over the course of the two games is a delight. Many people dismiss Robotics notes for not being as grim as the other science adventure games, but I think that's really unfair. It has just as much to offer as them, and I'm glad to have finally experienced them. Over the course of the year, I replayed all of the Yakuza games I'd progressed through in the past, in preparation for tackling 5, 6, and especially 7. I didn't really have to play the others again, but I've released all the brainworms, had infinite free time thanks to lockdown, and the regret that all Steam users feel when they rebuy games that they'd already completed, wasting money on something that they didn't really need. After hitting up 0 to 4, I was finally ready to continue on with the saga that I'd bumped myself out on a couple of years ago. A lot of people moan about the Yakuza series for being in the same environment every game, but there's definitely a joy and undercurrent of sadness visiting the familiar streets of Kamurocho, watching it evolve over time and, in a sense, beyond its own need for the people who made it what it was. I was kinda hesitant to start Yakuza 5 honestly. It's not a very well regarded entry in my social circles, and it's considered perhaps the most nonsensical of the entire series. Having played it, I guess I sort of agree. One of the main draws of Yakuza has always been the over-the-top telenovela quality of the main story, being at odds with the unbridled lunacy seemingly lurking around every corner of Japan. For what it's worth, I enjoyed seeing all the lads back. Didn't really mind the idle stuff, and I really enjoyed Shinada's inclusion into the game. His small town conspiracy story and his comedy duo with Takasugi being a particular highlight for me. As cheesy as his sentiment about dreams was, it's charming enough. Before I get back to that, I'll quickly gloss over the gameplay, but anyone who's played a Yakuza game knows what you're in for really, so I'll focus on how surprised I was with the side content. Saijima's Cabela game is surprisingly chunky, and Kiryu's Eurobeat tour was more in depth than I was expecting. Haruka's idol stuff was relatively decent as far as rhythm stuff goes, but I think I'll always be a Guitar Hero, Taiko no Tatsujin and Theatre Rhythm boy at heart. I do wish there was a bit more song variety though. I think I finished that story just in time before I started losing my rag hearing the same song over and over. Back to the story, I think this is probably the least invested I'd ever been in a Yakuza narrative. As much as a jack-the-lad Saijima is, his weird Matrix world in the prison only really served to pad out the game longer than necessary. My main man Akiyama was robbed of a proper campaign, several of the twists in Haruka's story missed the mark, and honestly, the final boss of the game is an absolute state and a half. I didn't think I could be less invested in a main villain than Jingu, but it was done with ease. At the end of the day, I did like the game and I even found myself smiling at the resolution of all the character arcs, but it just seemed like the game was in dire need of a bridging and getting a halfway satisfying main villain. Immediately upon starting Yakuza 6, I noticed that we were back in the Dragon engine. What a beautiful looking engine. Cutscenes in 5, 0 and Kiwami's engine look great as well, but you can borderline count the character's pose in a cutscene again now. The engine seemed to have a consequence on the PS4 in the performance. Thankfully I'd faffed about for so long that the game had come to PC and it ran flawlessly. I've seen a lot of flack online for the engine regarding the combat, but I still loved it. I like how seamless everything is, traversing Kamurocho and Hiroshima without load screens interrupting the flow of battle or entering buildings. The combat retains that manic brawl feeling I liked in Kiwami 2. It's not as tight as the previous games assuredly, but the ragdoll and the environmental damage was always entertaining. Instead of doing the normal bread and butter combos, I could sumo swing some overconfident punk into a bicycle, sending the bike and the punk propelling into a crowd of angry mates. There's a chunkiness to how Kiryu operates in general now, especially when you factor in his bizarre Super Saiyan overdrive mode, and the somewhat janky environmental stuff adds unpredictability into the brawls, which I appreciate. I don't want to discuss this story too heavily because I would have to delve into spoiler territory, but this was an incredibly satisfying conclusion to the Kiryu saga. I'd seen complaints online about how it was a Kiryu only game, how much smaller it was in scale regarding the environments and the content, and I'd have to disagree. Not only was this one of the most sincere personal storylines about Kiryu, it was the most invested in him as a character I'd been in several games. His humanity shines brightest in 2, 3 and 6. I have no real shame in admitting that I cried twice in the last few hours of the game, something I hadn't actually done in any of the other titles, and thankfully Sega have respected the game by focusing on other narratives so far after 6. I was happy how much focus Akiyama got as well. I heard he'd really been snubbed in this game, but he got a satisfying enough amount of screen time. I just wish Sega would stop robbing the boy of his own solo entry. All of the allies Kiryu makes in Hiroshima were all allowed to be fleshed out as well thanks to the smaller scope of the story. 2 of the recurring villains in the game as well became some of my favourite characters in the series. On top of that, there was a focus on Sunshine Orphanage from 3 which I loved. If you don't have time for Yakuza 3 and Kiryu's Dad Simulator, you're just wrong. I know opinions are subjective, but you're just dumb. It's amazing. Small issues I had about the story were how nothing I felt the secret of Hiroshima ended up actually being in the grand scale of things, and how crap the main villain was again. I'm not really sure if it's a cultural thing, but Japan and Ryuga Gotoku Studios really love having old businessmen as twist villains rather than working with their cooler already established characters. It was a weird decision in an otherwise incredibly satisfying finale. Once again, Goda Ryuji and Mine stand tall as the only cool final bosses in the series. Once again, the sub-stories are fantastic in 6. I really appreciated that they were now fully voice acted. One of the best parts about Yakuza is how idiosyncratic the divide between the main story and the sub-stories are, and allowing Kiryu to flex his acting chops in these ridiculous scenarios was a joy to hear. There was a nice and varied amount of them as well, not going overboard like the deluge of them in 3 through 5, where I gradually began to feel as if I was just doing never-ending busy work. I didn't care for the gang activity though, partly because I'm not really crazy about the genre it's mimicking, or how obtrusive it was in some points of the story, or just how brain dead it actually is in emulating some RTS mechanics. I know it's just a side mode in a beat 'em up, but there was very little depth to it, which is something that's quite paradoxical to real-time strategy. All I was doing was spawning big guys and making them slow walk across the map while dosing HP. I think it didn't really help that I'd already done the mode in Kiwami 2 and found it boring, and that was a more refined version of this. The other side content was fun as usual though, and the internet chat room was maybe one of the funniest things I've ever seen in a game. Watching Kiryu boomer type and simp over e-girls was something I didn't really know I needed in my life until I had it. Yakuza 7. I was finally here. I could get a day off my back since he'd been acting passive aggressive to me for months, since he bought me the game for Christmas and I only started playing it in summer. Ichiban immediately endeared himself to me. He's such a unique protagonist in comparison to everyone who's come before him. He's goofy, excitable, and he's a massive Dragon Quest fanboy. While Kiryu was empathetic, he was largely stoic and dragged into these bizarre scenarios. Ichiban, however, dives in head first. He's always enthusiastic and ready to help. I love how they tried to emphasise the difference in these characters by making their colour schemes inverted. All of the main party members are great, they all gel really well with Ichiban and each other, and it's just refreshing to have a JRPG party full of adults again for what feels like the first time since Persona 2 Eternal Punishment. The core cast of Namba, Saiko and Adachi in particular feel like a family of outcasts that have found each other. I made sure to do everyone's Bond episodes to completion. I wanted to know more about these new endearing characters, and I hope to see them again in Yakuza 8. My only issue was that the optional character was a bit underdeveloped due to their unlock conditions, and I wish a certain Korean character was a party member. The story itself was pretty strong. Having multiple main characters gave it a unique feeling and tone compared to previous entries. While Yakuza stories usually devolve into ludicrous twists and nonsensical developments, this one stays relatively grounded. This is an incredibly personal journey for Ichiban. He loses everything, and in the midst of that sadness and confusion, he never falters in his beliefs, choosing instead to help everyone else around him, even if it's at the cost of his own happiness. He grows so much over the course of the game and he learns that just because he hit rock bottom, it doesn't have to be a negative experience. I got really invested in the story and I cried near the end. It does a great job of making you empathise with just about every character, even the villains, excluding some of the more obvious disgusting exceptions. The stakes feel lower at the conclusion than most other games, but it's got a really satisfying final boss thematically, something most other games in the series cannot attest to having. The side content was really fun in this one, between the kart racing, can collecting, the cinema and the usual suspects like karaoke and baseball. I spent quite a lot of time playing the kart racing just for fun even after the storyline had finished, just because it was fun enough to dick about in, and it provided great rewards like stat boosters and CDs for the bar that you frequent. The property management mode is the largest offering in the game, like hostess clubs or gang battles before it. I'm not really sure what it is about these types of minigames honestly. It's such a tedious concept, and yet like the property stuff in Yakuza 0, I just sat and did it all quite happily. It's something that really shouldn't work, but I just get oddly engrossed in it. Maybe the soap opera nature of it just makes the Facebook game vibe of it sting less. As always, the sub-stories are hilarious and are all thankfully still fully voice acted like they were in 6. Some of them genuinely had me laughing out loud at the ridiculous premise of them, like Ichiban going out of his way to save and befriend a crawfish, fighting a giant Roomba, or fighting Jason from Friday the 13th. RPG mechanics were added in the progression of the game beyond fighting abilities for this one. Ichiban has personal stats like passion, charisma, style, etc, and these affect a few things regarding jobs, bonds and romance options. I like the concept of this. It means that people will end up building a different Ichiban depending on their responses throughout the game and which sub-stories they do. In practice though, it just means Ichiban is downing energy drinks and eating at restaurants 60 times in a row like an absolute madman for boosts. And when you try to woo your love interest of choice, you're deforesting a small nation just to give her like 100 bouquets of flowers. I picked Sumire by the way because she's best girl. On the gameplay side of things, it is pretty typical JRPG fare. I like how over the top and cinematic everything is. They really kept that Yakuza flair in the battling even if it is now turn based. The summons, or rather pound mates that they're dubbed, are a great way of rewarding you for exploration too. They're all rewards for sub-story and minigame completion rather than getting like a Swiss watch in previous entries. I like the variety in the job system. It allows you to mould everyone into specific classes like in classic RPGs. Some of the later characters start off so broken though that they never really have to change it up. My issue with the battle system was late into the game, the cinematic novelty of the attacks and the quirky enemies was beginning to disappear. Once you strip it of that, it's like its inspiration Dragon Quest, just a serviceable JRPG system. I hope to see it expanded upon in Yakuza 8 to maybe have cool extra additions like maybe the press turn system from Megami Tensei. I had a great time catching up with the series. After 4 and 5 just being fine, it was nice to have 2 brilliant games in 6 and 7 back to back. I just wish Judgment wasn't so tied up in those weird legal disputes so that it would get ported to PC already. I've already given up hope on Ishii never coming. In preparation for Shin Megami Tensei 5, I decided to go and replay all the mainline, including the original Megaten games. I had played the original Megami Tensei before but was relatively unimpressed, so when the 4 people online that had bothered to play 2 said that it was Kino and a hidden gem, I admit I couldn't really tell if this was boomer hipster nonsense or it was a genuinely fantastic and underappreciated JRPG. And much to my surprise, the game turned out to be brilliant. While Megami Tensei was an extremely loose adaptation of Nakajima Sigma Akechi's adventure, there was very little to the game. You were basically plonked into Tartarus with a loose goal of doing something or other. The demon summoning and talk concepts that were introduced there at the very least, but that's very little of what people would come to expect of the series going forward. With Megami Tensei 2, especially in the Kyoku version, I was just immediately blown away by the jump in quality regarding gameplay, music and story. Not to dismiss the original game songs, there are a few tunes in there, but Megaten 2 has the sauce. There's so many mood-setting themes and atmospheric tracks that have a sense of scale. I felt like Nakajima and Yumiko were basically bombing around the same 4 areas with no real aim, but Takuma in Megaten 2 immediately felt like he was on a journey. Everything that the Shin Megami Tensei series would become began here, and it was so cool to see. The lore that would come to define the series, how you explored Tokyo and the Makai realm, the cycle of law and chaos, Kaneko's contribution to art, they all began here in this humble 1990 RPG. This game basically was the template for the future Shin Megami Tensei 2, sharing many gameplay elements and concepts, and bizarrely I think they worked better here. Due to the smaller scale, it just felt snappier and there wasn't as much tedious backtracking that annoyed me in the middle section of SMT2. One of my favourite gaming related moments of the year happened while playing Megami Tensei II. I was about 3/4 of the way through the game and I was just completely lost. I legit had no idea what I was doing. After attempting it myself, I finally hit a threshold of, alright, okay, I gave it a good college try, let's just go online and find the answer. But there were none. For the first time in years, there was no walkthrough for this game. Barely anyone had played this translation, never mind chronicled it into a guide. I scoured forums, GameFAQs, and I even tried places like SMTG or Reddit. There was nothing. I even tried searching in Japanese, and I just could only really find maps, not guides. It was such a jarring and cool experience. Since then on YouTube there has been a few English LPs, but that doesn't really help me now. I had to work it out myself with no contextual clues. I can't even really remember the solution now. I think I had to fuse an element or something to progress through the Makai realm, but it just felt so satisfying to progress and work it out myself. Not even in like a oh my hard work paid off, I'm so smart way. I just couldn't get over the lack of information for the game. It felt like I was unearthing hidden secrets in a crypt untouched by civilization or something like Indiana Jones, rather than playing a game from a relatively esteemed series. Over the course of the game, Takuma also gets his arm lobbed off similarly to Ethan Winters from Resident Evil Village, earning the hilariously literal lost arm status effect. But unlike Ethan Winters who mopes about like a dry shite, he gets a bionic arm and proceeds to win post-apocalyptic fighting tournaments with a demon dog. I don't have to tell you who's a bigger legend, but I will. It's Takuma. Play Megami Tensei II. I deliberated for ages doing a full section on this like I initially planned, but I figured it would have too much in common with the Great Ace Attorney section coming later. I didn't want to not mention it though, given how much I loved it. A lot of people are down on the post-Shu Takuma era games, and while I somewhat agree in Ace Attorney 5 and Investigations 1, I feel Investigations 2 and Ace Attorney 6 stand up as brilliant games. The finale of 6, Turnabout Revolution, is one of the best chapters in the entire series. The cases are all interlinked besides the usual filler case. Apollo finally gets his time to shine in a resolution to his character arc, and it also featured the return of Maya, one of my earliest waifus in gaming, so how can it be bad? In 2021, I played the wonderful 101. Like Robotics notes, this seemed like something that would never ever leave Japan. An extremely Japanese-centric Ace Attorney releasing Capcom's Downfall era. It's crazy to think that we got both of them in a double pack at the same time. Unlike the totally not Japan, California setting of the mainline Ace Attorney games, these are set in Japan and England in the early 1900s. I never played the Layton crossover because I've never played a Layton game, so it was really cool to have a new setting, especially a culture closer to mine. It was cool to see so many slang terms that I was familiar with. With that setting comes racism though. The protagonist Ryunosuke experiences quite a lot of this due to being Japanese in London. They didn't really have to make England's casual racism 100% accurate, but they went for it. The official localisation makes it easier to digest in some of the terms in the fan translation, but I'm surprised how little they shied away from this potentially off-putting subject. The story in these ones are particularly great. I was a little surprised how directly both games tie into each other. The usual Ace Attorney formula has a bit of a time lapse between each game and a different core story, but the games here were both the setup and payoff of a longer running narrative. And when it finally gets to the final case, it concludes in such an incredible way. I don't think I've popped off so many times at an Ace Attorney finale in a long time. Everything is tied up and there's so many heartwarming and cool moments. The ending itself is so satisfying. It makes me yearn for more in that time period, but it's all the sweeter that we got something so special. The characters are really well written. Shu Takumi really knows how to create a strong cast. Particular standouts being Ryunosuke, Van Zieks, and especially Sherlock Sholmes. That might be the most jarring interpretation of Sherlock I've ever seen, but it's easily the best. He steals every scene he's in with his amazing himbo energy. There's never a dull moment when he's around, especially in the sequel. The only character who outlived his novelty was Soseki Natsume, a real-life poet who features in the duology. His gimmick quickly gets tired and he's in several cases. He seems to be a common point of frustration for other people that I've spoken to the game about. The animation and the presentation is the best it's ever been in the series. While there are some nice effects in Ace Attorney 5 and 6, the frame rate noticeably chugs from the 3D. Here though, everything is so smooth and the animations themselves are a lot more varied. Doing a dance of deduction or a summation examination is weirdly amazing to see. The animations themselves are quite basic in comparison to any other game, but after years in sprites and being locked behind desks, it's weirdly mind-blowing. Definitely pick these up if you're a fan of the series, or even if you need a jumping in point as a new player, they're great. The Great Ace Attorney, if you will. ImSim, or Immersive Sim, was a term that I would hear relatively often and think, stop being a bell end. There are FPS games where you don't shoot people constantly. Anyway, it turns out this is a genre that I've actually always liked but never really categorised. I've never really been into shooters myself, but I've always enjoyed stuff like System Shock, Thief, Deus Ex, The Darkness, Bioshock and a few other things. I'd heard Dishonored being compared to Thief and other games in particular, which piqued my interest. Dishonored Game of the Year and Dishonored 2 were about £3 a pop in CD key sites, so it was time to go. You play as Corvo in the first game, the bodyguard and part-time lover of Jessamine, the empress of a nation that's been overrun by a deadly rat plague. Sent overseas to acquire aid unsuccessfully, he returns to relay the information, and before he has enough time to even heat up a pot noodle, his secret girlfriend is murdered by assassins, his daughter Emily is kidnapped, and he's framed for it all. Tortured for 6 months, he escapes and joins a loyalist sect to rescue Emily and overthrow the corrupt overseers leading the nation of Dunwall into self-destruction. Corvo is mute throughout the game due to what I can only assume is stage fright, since he's walked it off and got himself a cool gruff dad voice in 2, voiced by Garrett of Thief fame no less. He also gets a cool mask and gains otherworldly powers off an ancient entity known as the Outsider. A being in that world that shows as a stark warning to religious zealotry and a scary nighttime story for children, who in actuality is just some moody emo guy spitting out non-sequiturs about Corvo and judging him for positioning unconscious bodies in humorous ways. I've seen a lot of criticism online for the story of the first game, and perhaps rightfully so. It is a very minimal story and none of the twists that occur are particularly shocking, but I couldn't help but like it. I think it was due to some of the characters being well written and acted enough to compensate, and there was a surprising amount of effort that went into the world building through the usual suspects of the genre, audio logs and letters. A shocking amount for what is otherwise an 8-hour game where you could just romp through it murdering folk in a haze. The first game bizarrely also isn't really even referenced in the succeeding entries. Instead the DLC, the Knife of Dunwall and the Brigmore Witches are what tie into future games. These instead follow Dowd, the man who assassinated the Empress, kicking off the events of the game in the first place. I consider it quite a risky move because the main villain of the DLC, a witch named Delilah, is also the main villain in the second game. Given the space in between the original game's release and its DLC, it's quite possible that some players just wouldn't have played it, and then been completely out of the loop for her motivations in the second game. Dowd's story is also the precursor to the standalone expansion pack Death of the Outsider, which focuses on his second-in-command Billy and concludes both of their stories. The story in the second game, set 17 years after the original, overall is an improvement, and it can be told from either the perspective of Corvo or his daughter Emily. Both have their own powers and perspectives on the story refreshingly instead of just being model swaps of each other. Corvo is older now and a bit more jaded, and Emily, while morally sound, has to outgrow the privileged sheltered life she's had to become a better empress. The difference in their powers encourages multiple replays. The map design in these games are fantastic. It kinda reminds me of the modern Hitman games in the way that it just dumps you in a level with only a vague sense of what you're doing, and just lets you explore to your heart's content. The games really reward you for searching about. There's always going to be a hidden room with treasure or lore. There are timed and scripted events that play out as you progress through the map too, as well as ongoing side quests with recurring NPCs. Some characters live and die depending on your actions in many of the games, and not just because of like an arbitrary decision to kill or spare them in the moment. Usually there's longer running consequences that pay off in the future. I spent longer than was necessary in a lot of the levels just messing about looting for files, treasures and loot. There's a sense of satisfaction of just robbing everyone blind and not having them cop on too. I wasn't even really doing it for the upgrades either, it was just like a satisfying scavenge hunt. There's so much stuff off of the beaten path, and rewards beget rewards. There's one particular mission in Death of the Outsider that rewards you for robbing a bank as the most important figures that own it are having a meeting in the same room without being detected or incapacitating them. I felt so smug doing it too, even though it didn't really impact the story at all. A lot of the bone charms and runes will spawn extra dialogue with Outsider as well, who will usually provide extra context about your current target. This is one of the areas where the game shine the brightest in general, gameplay informing narrative. On top of a fully realised world, actions speak louder than words. The Outsider as an entity is both revered and reviled, an ageless man who grants those who encounter him heretical abilities, and yet at the end of the day I consider him a neutral entity in the purest sense. In his own words, he gives people power and wants to witness what they'll do with it. He gave Corvo his powers in the first game because he was curious to see what a man with the purest intentions would do once the world beat him down repeatedly and tarnished his name. Both friendly and hostile NPCs, as well as the world around you, change depending on whether you're being a pacifist or a murder-hungry gimp in many ways. As an example in the first game, you can witness members of the Overseers comfort a man who believes he's coming down with the rat plague, and they mercifully put him to rest along with their heartfelt sympathies at losing a friend. On the flip side, in the High Chaos version, you can encounter them turning on him, calling him disease, and they execute him while he's begging for his life. The chaos you create in the original game perpetuates cynicism in Emily as well. Over the course of the game, she'll become obsessed with how many people you've murdered, become unsympathetic to the deaths of the people related to her, and her drawings will distort from still life or Corvo to crime scenes and Corvo's mask, a symbol used to inspire fear and, in the eyes of the public, a serial killer. In the second game, Emily herself slips into some rather sociopathic thinking if you kill too many people. Corvo, just give your daughter a copy of Amagami or something, she'll ease up pretty sharpish. One of the things I'm not a fan of in these games, particularly the original Dishonored, is that it really encourages murder runs, yet almost seems to punish you for not going for them. If you're going for a stealthy low chaos playthrough, your options are strangling people, sleep darts, or simply avoiding them altogether. I didn't really mind being limited when I was playing it all too much, but watching the freedom afforded to you when the morality system doesn't matter is pretty crazy. All of Corvo's other abilities tie into his blink ability naturally. You can teleport, freeze time, set up some Dio-esque floating arrows, stab people, slide past, throw down some mines, and then zip right out before time resumes and not even be noticed. It's fast, free flowing, and it honestly looks like super hot in motion. It's just incredibly satisfying and cool. Emily as a playable character can also create replicas of herself with her doppelganger ability, enthrall enemies, and even psychic link them so that if you knock out someone, it creates a chain reaction. My favourite of the bunch was Shadow Walk, which was honestly quite imbalanced, as it allows Emily to turn into a little shadow monster like Eddie from Guilty Gear and crawl around. Speaking of the chaos system, in most missions you can lethally or non-lethally incapacitate your targets. All of the non-lethal options end up being particularly cruel and ironic punishments for the recipients, so much so that it's weird to think of them as morally correct answers. One standout example leads Corvo knocking out a woman and delivering her to her creepy stalker, who says he'll take care of her for the rest of her life. It's a pretty scary outcome, and I would imagine she would rather have been killed than be the sex slave of some maniac. And if she's still alive by the time Dishonored 2 begins, she'll have been at it for 17 years. And yet, after watching her sail into the sewers with her captor, you can munch away in the food in her fridge, sign the guest book in the party you've infiltrated, and whistle along to your Spotify mix on the way out, without a care in the world. One of the coolest examples of divergent options afforded by the level design comes in the Dust District, a small mining town in Sarkonos that you visit in Dishonored 2. When you arrive, the Overseers are fighting with a local gang, the Howlers. Where most missions have a target that you can kill or non-lethally dispose of, this one has around 5 or so ways to complete it. Your actions shift the balance of this stalemate between the two factions. When you enter the level, you're presented with a Jindosh lock, which is a door lock with an enigmatic riddle. Your initial options are to scratch the back of either side and they'll give you the solution. And of course you can side with the gang or the overseers by delivering the opposing side's leader to them dead. These are the lethal options, and it can be done in all the regular ways. Conversely, the non-lethal option has you coming to the conclusion that both sides are perpetuating a cycle of misery for the townsfolk and decide that it's better just to dispose of both of them. You render both of them unconscious and ship them off to be workers in the awful conditions of the mine they exploit. You've raised two problems and you've found the code from their possessions. Alternatively, you can sneak around the Dust District never actually interacting with either faction directly, and piece together a solution from contextual clues and notes left behind by other people who are trying to figure out the solutions themselves, rewarding exploration and observation. And of course you can simply just work out the Jindosh solution from the get-go if you're feeling like a 5-head. The solution changes per run, so it can't just be looked up in a matter of seconds, and while speedrunners have narrowed it down to a certain pattern, it would still take a proper scan of it to work out the correct answer. Either way, working out the riddle allows you to bypass the entire level in theoretically 2 minutes without resorting to exploration or battle in any shape or form. I honestly want to go on more, but if I do, it will turn into a Dishonored retrospective rather than the general 2021 video. I do want to give a special shout out to a Crack in the Slab, a level from the second game, which might honestly be one of the coolest levels ever in any game ever made. I enjoyed all three titles, but Dishonored 2 was a peak, with its amazing level design and how often it introduced interesting new core mechanics. It never got stale. They were fantastic games, and I cannot wait to play Prey this year. Maybe Deathloop if I see it cheap enough. Dark Souls 2 is a game I'd heard a lot about over the years. One of those polarising experiences. Considered the worst in the Soulsborne conglomerate by many, but loved by others, including some of my close friends. So as I said in last year's video, I probably played and completed Dark Souls for the first time. Dark Souls 2 then was the next logical step, although I was still hesitant to play Dark Souls 3 again after the chunk of it I'd played at release that was like firing night nurse into my veins. I actually did start playing Dark Souls 2 the day after finishing the first game 100%. It was a nice opportunity to play more co-op with my friends, a group notorious for not having any games in common to play anymore. We jumped right in, and well, it seemed alright. Me and my co-op partners Day and Dara had some adventures, but as you get older it gets harder and harder to coordinate a time to play, and especially one at Dark Souls 2 that has the infamous soul memory mechanic. That being a feature where you can only partner up with people within a certain level threshold, making it hard to catch people up who can maybe not make a session or two and then naturally the run just tapered off. A month or two later I decided that I'd continue the run with Darrow, and for whatever reason my save had corrupted. As frustrating as that was, I got help from another friend for items and blasted through to where I was before with a focus strength Unga Bunga build. We memed our way through Jabba the Hutt, that glitchy mess of a boss the Executioner's Chariot, and then we started our journey up the Earthen Peak. We got to the top, passed through the fog door, and where Maida the Baneful Queen should be was an empty room. No matter what we did, Maida just wouldn't show up. Resets, reinstalls, single player, multiplayer, Steam defrags, save backups, she just simply wouldn't spawn. This pretty much killed the run stone dead. I couldn't get to the Iron Keep or progress the game. Incredibly annoyed, that was the end of another run. I was beginning to think this was one of the most cursed games I'd ever played. Flash forward to August 2021, it was time for one last attempt. If the game bugged out or if I lost the save again, I would just drop the game for good. This time, equipped with a sorcery build and soul spear, Nonce Killer, the mage, sent out a request to, I wasn't actually sure, I'd never actually gotten far enough to find out the lore. Killing Nonces of course was the primary goal, but maybe this time I'd find out what she came to the land to do. Eventually I made it to Iron Peak with the help of some friends and progressed for the first time in months. I actually began to appreciate the game this time. I liked how Majula would gradually grow from a desolate little town into a somewhat populated safe haven for outcasts. I loved the music of it and how it was perpetually in twilight. There was a melancholy to it. Despite everything that was going on, that respite offered a faint glimmer of hope that everything could get back on track and rebuild. The bosses and areas I visited in the latter half of the game, including the DLC, kept giving me whiplash. I would find myself loving one area and then being exasperated the next. Most of the main game areas were relatively consistent, I suppose, but the Black Gulch and Bloom Tower areas just seem to drag on, with Bloom Tower in particular being what I consider the low point of the game. I guess it didn't help that the 3 people who were playing with me resented the DLCs, and maybe that coloured my mood towards them. The third DLC, on the other hand, Alium Lois and the Grand Cathedral, I really enjoyed. It was an open-ended, non-linear area and I really liked traversing it. I guess that it helped that it looked aesthetically beautiful as well, as snow levels often do. The Old Chaos is one of the coolest battles in the series for me personally as well, helping it solidify itself as a memorable area. The endgame was pretty satisfying and the last few bosses were pretty interesting from a lore perspective. I think in some weird way 2's lore is my favourite in the series, because I had to repeat it so often that it stuck in my head more naturally than the others. I don't think I could name anyone from Dark Souls 3's lore if I'm honest. Dark Souls 3 will also never have a celebrated meme figure in the same way that Navlan became for the group I played with, where he became a caricature of himself who could only creepily say his own name like a messed up Pokemon. Speaking of Dark Souls 3, I did replay it after all. As I mentioned earlier, in the past I unceremoniously dropped it after a few sessions at the time of release. I decided to give it another chance, where I didn't actually finish it this time and see if I judged it too harshly. I was willing to give it the benefit of the doubt, and I went from hating Dark Souls 3 to not minding it. I spent a day or two really thinking on how to write my thoughts about this game. I only finished it in like early September and I barely remember anything of it beyond coincidentally loving the snow area again, and the most memorable boss in the game for me being Sister Frieda. Genuinely, my only real memories about the game are of PvP. I'm not really sure if indifference is better than disliking it. I've since come back to DS2 Scholar with Sash and Darrow individually for co-op runs and found myself appreciating that game even more just because I finished 3 in such a stupor. Diz calls it Stockholm Syndrome, but I just genuinely like 2 more than 3 by a fair margin. It's a flawed game that has higher highs and lower lows than the others, but I prefer it to the safely bland game that is 3. In my restless dreams I see that town. Majula. Tales of is a series that I've loved for a long time. Back in the 360 days, Bandai could have hired me as a marketing manager for Tales of Vesperia, considering how often I showed it to my friends. Vesperia itself, for the longest time, was my favourite game. Over time, the series began to stagnate though, with fine but unambitious titles like Grace's F or Exilia. It seemed like nothing would reach the highs of Abyss, Vesperia or Destiny R regarding story, gameplay or just the sense of adventure again. Even the music itself, Motoi Sakuraba's iconic scores, were going through the motions. By Zesteria's release, I was all but ready to give up on the series. Something had been lost along the way, which many attributed to Hideo Baba's involvement. Eventually the fantastic Tales of Berseria was released without his involvement, and while it was a step in the right direction, it still had the unfortunate existence of being a prequel to Zesteria, and it was made the same engine and gameplay style of every Tales game since the mid-2000s. Enter Tales of Arise. For the first time in 20 years, everything was revamped. The engine and model types had been recycled from Vesperia onwards, the gameplay that had been there and only slowly refined since Symphonia, how skits were presented, just about everything. Sakuraba even stopped phoning in the music. It was kinda everything I wanted. In older Tales games, battles were on a 2D plane but in a 3D space. You could semi-auto or manually attack, and running in 3D space required the free running ability, which depending on the game would consume stamina. Sometimes attacks would be completely freeform, working off an SP system like a traditional JRPG, or the Blast Caliber system originating in Destiny where you would have a certain amount of icons, and special attacks would use a set amount of them. Arise feels like a natural evolution of the Blast Caliber system. The battle arenas are now fully 3D with unhindered motion, and the camera isn't in a fixed perspective anymore. There's more of an emphasis on dodging and countering as well. You can't really damage sponge and mash through encounters as easy as previous games. Dodging also rapidly refills your icons for activity, so it's in your best interest to do so if you want to perform some more elaborate combos. It felt like everyone had the snap pivot function of Jude from Exilia, without having to play as the Simp Boy himself. The combat overhaul led to something that I'd never done before in Tales. I was using the entire cast for combat. I think whenever someone plays Tales, they'll mess about and give everyone a try at first, but eventually slouch into a character archetype, be it the sword, melee or magic user, unless you're one of those big dick G's who makes combo mads or something. I'd say I became the most proficient with Kisara and Alphen, but I really enjoyed the lore, Rinwell and Shion too. Dohalim was the only character I couldn't really wrap my brain around on operating. Thanks to the camping system, Alphen can become closer to the rest of the cast through unique events. These allow benefits and buffs in battle which allow for combo attacks and supers. In combat, in addition to your own attacks, your performance fills up meters for your AI companions, so you can manually make them use attacks which often serve as great combo extenders to keep up battle flow tempo or for flashy finishing moves. The game made it all too easy to switch characters around in the flow of battle without pausing or having to menu, which led to me messing around and trying to create a bunch of combos I ended up quite proud of. I was consistently able to get significant combo chains, something I can't really say I achieved in many other Tales entries outside of spam characters or the more automated titles like Grace's F. I can't even really count Grace's F because I had a flowchart. This was entirely dependent on muscle memory and my own labour, which made it feel more rewarding. One of the gripes I do have regarding the game is the level scaling. There's several occasions where you're going to encounter dire foes or a quest will open up in an optional dungeon where the enemies are significantly high on level. Dire foes, which are like optional boss monsters, aren't really a new concept in the series, but when there's a higher level gap than say 10, enemies get super armor, don't stagger and just receive no damage whatsoever. I feel this is quite counterintuitive to low level runs or the revamped combat system itself. To give an example, the first dire foe you come across in the game is probably around level 42, and when you encounter it you're most likely around level 7 or 8. In a Hail Mary decision of screw it, I'm gonna give it a go, I gave it an attempt. Thanks to the ease of the perfect dodging and countering from the new combat system, I managed to survive until I got bored. With such a gap in levels, it's relatively understandable that I'd be doing such little damage, but it seemed to apply later, as I said, to things that were just barely above me. I was linked a video at the time by Kohoko who revealed that a Japanese player did beat that first dire foe, but it took 8 real hours. That seems like less of a skill issue and more of a grind. For quite a while I'd always come to say that Tales of was about the character interactions rather than the story. Tales stories are always relatively the same deal. In a comforting way I suppose, but besides Tales of the Abyss, none of them are particularly stellar. The main draw in most games are the protagonists and how they would interact with each other. There's always usually a comfy dynamic and the skit system is something I think is genius. The skit system has been overhauled for the game as well. Now they're presented almost like manga panels instead of a few pre-drawn sprites. It has a flow to it now that makes it less static to watch, and it uses in-game models so your costume choices are actually reflected for the first time in them. It's an amazing way to flesh out the characters for those who want it, but optional enough to not be obtrusive for people who maybe don't have the time, don't care, or are perhaps speedrunning. I think a sign of good writing is knowing what makes a character who they are outside of the current plot or immediate activity. To know that they actually live and have hobbies, goals and desires and aren't just simply one-dimensional. To quickly give an example, it's what makes Yoshikage Kira such a strong character in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. If we hadn't been exposed to his life, he would simply just be another nameless stand-using goon. Basically everyone in Stardust Crusaders. I really love the characters and story in this one. Arise was one of the first games in a few years that I went into full no life mode over, just simply because I wanted to see what happened next. I was really invested in all of them, especially the blossoming friendship and romance of the two lead protagonists, Alphen and Shion. The voice actors for both, Ray Chase and Erika Lindbeck, absolutely nailed their performances. Definitely two of my favourites in the western scene. The changes in story and party dynamic were pretty welcome. It's a bit more grim than the average Tales given the subject matter of oppression and slavery, but doing so it sidestepped a lot of the traditional Tales and JRPG tropes. The party in the game are a lot more fragmented than usual. There's an understandable tension between the races of the Danins and Renins, which creates a bit of a caustic environment sometimes. Instead of being on a jovial adventure with like-minded people, it takes them several arcs to open up to each other. It's incredibly satisfying when they do though. When the race and societal dynamics break down, they come to find that they have a lot in common, friendships and romantic relationships opening up in the process. While it's not the first game to tackle themes of oppression or slavery being bad, even in its own series given Rebirth, it's still really cathartic to see these characters develop past their deeply ingrained prejudices and form an unlikely family. It became the first Tales of game in a while that I went out of my way 100%. I wanted to see all the interactions between the cast, so I got all the skits, cooked all the meals, found all the collectibles, did all the arena and side games, and generally just filled out everything just to see as much as I could of the game. My favourite of which being the fishing minigame, which I get bizarrely addicted to. I'm not sure who said it first, but you can't have a true JRPG without a fishing minigame. Fishing as a whole just felt more important in this one in general, given how the camp functions, how buffs are once again provided by food, and how little money the party always seems to have. Fish are a good source of protein, and the bigger ones rake in some dosh. It was satisfying seeking out all the boss fish, because some of them were sturdy as hell to reel in. It was quite challenging. It was nice to see how many skits and rewards it provided for the party as well. I also loved how the rarer baits were all in the shape of former Tales of mascots. It was a nice little cameo for them. Speaking of the camp, despite my praise earlier, it also hosts one of my biggest complaints about the game. I'm not sure if it's been patched out by now, but when I played the game, every time you rest at one it has a menu saying, "Hey, why don't you buy the DLC?" It's kind of immersion shattering. One of my favourite things about Tales of were the amount of costumes and accessories you could earn for the cast by completing in-game challenges and side quests. Over time around the Exilia era, more and more of the costumes were out of the base game in favour of charging for extremely overpriced DLC packs. £5 or £6 for a couple of outfits is ridiculous. It was extremely pervasive in the later entries before Arise, where the only in-game unlockables tended to be palette swaps. Arise is better about it in the sense that there's actually quite a fair share of alternate costumes in the game, albeit quite late. It doesn't excuse the fact that the game had 40 quid of costume DLC in release though, it's just greed. Don't even get me started in that Sword Art Online DLC pack, it's like £13 by itself. Besides that, I was super pleased with the game. It really is a revival of the series for me after Zestiria took it out behind the farm of the trusty double barrel. Let's just hope we avoid going down that path again. This game had been on my backlog for several years. I'd always been meaning to play it, but for some reason never got to it. When I was a kid, one of my dreams was to be a 1930s styled private eye detective type, and it still to this day pains me that I'll probably never solve a murder mystery in my lifetime. Not that you're a detective in Obra Dinn, you're just an insurance appraiser, but if this game is to be believed, they require about the same skill set. The Obra Dinn is a desolate, abandoned ship, and everyone that departed on its voyage is now dead. You have a cursed but cool looking skeleton watch that can rewind time until the moment of each of their tragic ends. You have to figure out how exactly they died, work out who they are and match them to an old photograph of the crew. Very rarely is there concrete evidence of someone's identity. You need to explore the ship, cross-reference memories and really pay attention to their accents, nationalities, clothing, where they reside and what their job might be. You find out if your hunches are correct in groups of force. It's really hard to brute force a lot of it. This is a game that really makes you feel like Billy Big Bollocks when you work out a really satisfying mystery. Admittedly, some of the solutions can be quite obtuse. I don't really see the need to differentiate between getting stabbed and getting speared. The game's aesthetic is understated and lo-fi, and it's one of the most unique, coolest games I've ever played, but the only problem is you can only play it once. This was another Namco Bandai game I played this year, but weirdly small budget compared to Tales of Arise. I had a lot of fun with this one, but it felt like a Vita game that had been ported to modern systems rather than a current gen release. Cutscenes are largely presented like the skits in Tales of Arise, with only important scenes actually getting animation. The gameplay's pretty fun. I like the psychokinetic powers and the mechanic of borrowing your squad's powers for exploration. The characters are quite enjoyable and the story's decent enough. Nothing to write home about, but I ended up getting attached to some of them. I did appreciate that there were two full campaigns that weren't merely a character swap, they're two halves of a bigger narrative. The soundtrack was extremely vibey. I wasn't expecting how catchy it would actually be. It reminds me of Digimon Cyber Sleuth's soundtrack. One of my favourite things about the game is the base you start off in. It's initially just an empty room that grows into a space that really feels lived in as you progress through the story and become closer to your party members. It reminds me of your room in Persona 4 and 5, which you can decorate similarly, but just on a bigger scale. If it's ever on sale, give it a go. It'll probably only be a $5 and you can definitely do a lot worse. The battle system was the best it's ever been. There's plenty of build variety, the soundtrack is great. It's nice seeing all the demons in 3D again. I really disliked the characters and story, and by the end of it the barren open world had outlived its novelty. The ending and routes being so completely homogeneous soured me even further. I was originally going to do a full section for this game tearing into it, but I didn't really want to ruin the vibe of an otherwise positive video. I do want a meme plush though, they're pretty cool. Upon doing the voiceover, I only just remembered that I did a negative section for Resident Evil Village earlier on and just simply forgot I even played that game. Oh dear. Playing co-op with Matt and Sash in Dying Light was one of the most hilarious experiences I've ever had in a game. Instead of running for our lives in fear from the super zombies, we basically spent half an hour kicking our heads in at the front door of the safe house while laughing at the ambient background noises. Some rando then joined us and showed us that Dying Light invaders are genuinely scary unlike Dark Souls ones, as they jumped about 500 feet into the air and knocked us off the radio tower we thought we were so safe on. I think ever since I've known him, Darryl has had terrible internet. It was so bad back in the day you couldn't even play Animal Crossing in 3DS. In December he somehow convinced me to play Halo Remastered even though I don't like Halo. It led to one of the most bizarre and unique experiences I've ever had though, second person gaming. At one point his connection intermittently cut out while hosting and my screen froze as a result. However, in his game I was still there and moving about. He then streamed his screen in Discord to me and I attempted to finish the rest of the level from his perspective of me. It was incredibly jarring, but maybe the most memorable thing to have ever happened to me in any Halo game, so thanks Phil. In October, after 2 years of sitting around in my room moping about like a dickhead, I took my first steps out of Scotland since lockdown. I went to visit one of my oldest and best friends, Day. Between laughing at episodes of Family Feud, playing Age of Calamity and retro Castlevania games, we sat and completed a co-op run in Mario 3D World. We played the whole thing over the course of a weekend and I loved it. It was fun from start to finish and it really made me miss couch co-op. Despite how much shit I give Nintendo, they still provide the banter content and multiplayer. It really was just a charming wee game that was well paced, varied, and it never outstayed its welcome, unlike the co-op modes in New Super Mario Bros. For the Wii. Games which brought out some homicidal tendencies one Christmas where several of my family members kept laughing and jumping off cliffs, and my moody teenage brain got so ludicrously salty. Speaking of salt, that passed on today though. There was one occasion where I was running, picked him up and then promptly jumped into the ether. I wasn't even trying to troll him either. The running grab buttons are both tied to B, and I just simply misjudged the depth perception. You can't pause the game and scream upset. It's definitely one of my favourite gaming related moments ever. I can't even really explain myself either. Like, before I just destroyed a Castlevania game, then I was making these weird dumb mistakes in Mario. If I had to guess, it's maybe the physics and camera. That wasn't a combination of me just being crap at the game, but I mean, yeah. Sadly we didn't get to Bowser's Fury. I want to next time, but he's traumatised and refuses to go back with me. When I was young, despite having access to both Sega and Nintendo, I vastly preferred the 2D Sonic games to Mario. Even then though, I had the common sense not to play the Game Gear entries. One day while bored this year though, I had the morbid curiosity to go and finish them all since they're only about 30 minutes apiece. Sonic Blast ended up being one of the worst games I've ever played. I have no idea what possessed them to release this. It makes no sense either because some of the previous entries, while bad or mediocre, had some redeeming aspect. This game was just unbelievably bad. Sonic keeps betraying me even when not releasing new games. What happened, mate? With those out of the way, let's get to the final game I played last year. I used to write short stories when I was a teenager. I would never show them to anyone and they were mostly just a stress outlet, but I learned the general gist of how hard it is to make a compelling narrative in a world that feels like it actually exists outside of the scope of your story. You have to think of characters, the setting, history, concepts of ideology, politics, the era and more. It's all too easy to fall into the trap of underdeveloping an idea but not having a grander concept, to have people question the consistency and lore of your creation. One failure usually has a domino effect if people aren't able to have a certain suspension of disbelief in what you're presenting. In regards to 13 Sentinels, it was a game that I'd seen being called peak fiction, kino, the best thing Atlas has ever released in years, but no one would ever really go into why. A general gist of loving the characters and story, but being unable to go into it, just something you had to experience for yourself. To tie it back into the first paragraph, all I knew about the game beyond the genre being a visual novel and RTS hybrid was that it had 13 playable characters who would fight in the mechs, the 13 Sentinels as it were. To me, writing 13 viewpoints seemed like an absolute logistical nightmare, something that would be varying in quality for sure. Something really not helped by the genre being sci-fi, probably one of the harder things to write believably. Not only would you have 13 individual sub-stories and characters to create and conceive, but they'd have to be satisfying enough to stand in their own merit and important enough to tie into a larger narrative. On top of it, it would have to be presented in a way that wouldn't be utterly incomprehensible or perhaps too ambitious to the layman. I remember going to see Inception in the cinema with some friends, and one of them, Rory, on the way out was already reading a plot synopsis on Wikipedia for what he just watched. Starting the game, I wondered if it could live up to the hype or if it could deliver on the idea of everything above, and to my pleasant surprise, it did. It was the last game I played in 2021 and I'd probably say it's my favourite of the bunch too, ending on a high note. I can understand why people maybe found it hard to talk about without spoiling now. Not only are there 13 characters with their own stories, but there are many important NPCs with prominence in the greater narrative. On top of it, there are several time periods, most prominently being the ones of 1945, 1985 and 2025. On top of it, the story plays out in the order that you wish. You start off with a prologue and a singular character, and as you progress through it you'll unlock the rest of the cast. This doesn't play out in chronological order, even the intro itself comes from near the end of the story. When you shift a new character, you'll have to ascertain what point in time you're at in the grand scheme of things, as everything ties together. Stories playing get locked off at certain intervals if you've not progressed through other characters or the RTS sections enough. It's carefully crafted to not have you blaze through a singular character and overloading plot twists that might undermine revelations in a different character's tale. I really like the approach to the storytelling. I'm often called overly critical of stories and characters in games, but I think it's because the medium has its own unique way of forming a story that can only ostensibly be told in a game. Books remain the gold standard for people in regards to telling a story. So much information can be provided and crafted to any degree since it relies on your own imagination. Movies and television, however, can only really do so much within the confines of a budget, acting premise, casting choice, directing, and there'll often be pressure from investors or whatever. Which is why most of the time, when a book is adapted into a film or a TV show, or say a visual or light novel into an anime, people will be overly critical. People can't and won't react to something in the same way. The nuance of something can be interpreted in a myriad of ways. It's hard to satisfyingly condense something that might take 20 to 40 hours to read into, say, 12 episodes of a movie. Even universally loved adaptations in 3D and 2D like Lord of the Rings or Steins Gate have detractors for inaccuracies to the source, never mind a bad adaptation. Two fantastic games with narratives that stuck with me, Silent Hill 2 and Chaos Head, are things that I can't really picture being told in a satisfactory manner in any other medium. The Silent Hill movies and the horrific Chaos Head anime adaptation only really solidified that notion. The headspace that you get into, that you feel as James or Takumi, their protagonists, is something that's only achievable because they're your gateway into the world. It's impossible to adapt the dread of being completely isolated and alone like James is when he's exploring the town, or the paranoia and fear that Takumi experiences throughout the serial murder cases, because you're in their perspectives. Things can be conveyed to you without being explicitly said. A lot of the horror in these two cases aren't even from what happens in the story itself, but from implications or speculation that you make as you progress. So many inferences can be made. When it comes to games, I think so many factors can influence world building or how you tell a story. Environmental design, gameplay, character design, the story itself, contextual hints, hidden secrets. There's just so many factors that cannot be replicated in a non-interactive medium. Like those two, 13 Sentinels feels like it can only be told in a game. The shifting of perspectives allows you to view the same scene twice from a different character's viewpoint, and by the time they do, how you view it yourself is completely changed. The non-linearity of how you tackle the game, as I said before, means you could give the game out to several people and they will not have the same experience. Someone might prefer just to play the real-time strategy sections immediately, or someone might prefer just to do a deep dive in the story. But even with that, there's so many characters to choose from, people can do it in about any order. A character you love might get priority over one you're indifferent to or simply just don't like, and that will change the context of how you or others view a portion of the game. Another thing that I love that the game has is a feature that I love in science adventure as well, a terminology glossary. It allows you to peruse the information and gain extra context about the characters in the world at your own leisure without breaking the pace of the main story. Characters won't have to plot dump information to you, everything is already there if you want to delve deeper. Some are interesting, some are comedic, and some are just tidbits about society, but they all serve a purpose. Everything does eventually tie into another, and experiences will all be different until the end. I think it'll be an incredible game to revisit with context too, given how well things are foreshadowed. There are always subtle, or sometimes blatant hints about upcoming plot twists, be it a character interaction or just carefully observing backgrounds, as events do play out when you're contemplating or talking to people in the game. The files come into play for it too. The story itself centres around an alien invasion from extraterrestrial beings known as the Deimos, ones that indiscriminately destroy everything and can only be defeated by the mechas known as the Sentinels. The game starts in medias res, so you then have to flash back and find out each character's story and how they ended up at the climactic final battle. The story is a love letter to sci-fi and mecha in general. The amount of references to other works or homages to them in both the story and their concepts is insane. I'd be here all day listening, but here's just a few examples from the Deluge. War of the Worlds, Terminator, Steins Gate, Total Recall, Macross, Source Code, The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, E.T., basically just anything you can think of. Some of those aren't even universal too, but just the premise of a single character's story, which then fits into its own created world. Each story has its own unique vibe, so there will without a doubt be a story or character that would interest you as a fan of sci-fi. One minute you can be an 80s punk trapped in a time loop, the next minute you can be an amnesiac assassin being hunted for the murder of an unknown woman. I would love to go on about the story in depth, but I wouldn't want to rob a viewer of the chance to experience the game for the first time in full. All the footage that's been used in this video will be from the prologue segments of each character. I can't say though that the game concluded in such a satisfying manner. Finishing off each individual story and then coming full circle from the intro to where they're defending the city is a hell of a journey. After finishing the last mission and returning to the epilogue, I was so happy with everything. I'm prone to saying that Japanese stories often flub the ending, but 13 Sentinels thankfully knocked it out of the park. There wasn't anything unresolved, there wasn't anything that I was upset or annoyed about. I was just like, whoa, that was amazing. Even 2 months later, as of recording this, it still occupies my thoughts about how ambitious it was as a whole and how unique it is, and I'm still in that post-nut clarity over how I won't get to experience it for the first time ever again. Each character in the game is given plenty of screen time and developed naturally over the course of the story. I'd like to say everyone gets an even amount, but some characters' story runtime is a little on the low side, but it's never to a detriment. They're all distinct in not only appearances but personalities. There's very little overlap in how they view the world, act towards each other, and their internal monologue. I guess there are 2 punk characters, but that's a bit of a reach. To have 13 main characters and give them unique personalities is something that most games can only dream of, and yet it was pulled off so nicely. Their personalities inform their decisions over the game. Each scenario would differ dramatically if you switched around the protagonists. In a lot of Japanese media, I feel like characters are interchangeable and the story ends up suffering for it. with people merely being archetypes with nothing more to offer. Every protagonist and major NPC in 13 Sentinels though has a purpose for being there, there's no extraneous fluff. I think how you feel about each character will obviously depend on your personal taste, as it always does. While there's no characters I actually dislike, there are ones where I feel they perhaps have less depth. For me, it's Iori. While she's got a lot of redeeming qualities, too much of her journey centred on her falling in love with shonen strangers. As such, I would say I became less invested in her overall because of that. The other characters are the anchor of their own stories in a way that she sorta wasn't. Maybe I'm just being too harsh. Earlier I mentioned that you revisit scenes from other characters' perspectives. I'd replayed Nier earlier in the year thanks to the Replicant edition, and while I still loved it, repeating the same story over and over soured me in a way that it didn't in the past. That was averted here thankfully. The internal narration and perspective also keeps it fresh. Things that were maybe obfuscated or simply just didn't seem important to one character might be for another. Usually a scene is only brought back if it had hidden implications. The game is absolutely beautiful to look at. There's so much love and detail to every character in the adventure sections. Their designs are vibrant, distinct, and I think give off a good grasp of what their character and personality will be. Just have a certain flair to them. Their personalities can even be inferred off the animations themselves. They all have distinct habits, even down to the simple actions of walking, running or thinking. Idle animations too give off a sense of personality, and they're even used in clever foreshadowing. The environments, as always in a Vanillaware game, are gorgeous. Like I said, everything is so incredibly detailed. The backgrounds, props and items are all lovingly crafted. Food in particular always looks so delicious in all of their games. The game's most common setting, the 1980s, is more often than not dyed in orange with the setting sun, giving it such a melancholy vibe even during the early slice of life sections. Even though it's set in a country I'm not native to, and in a time period that I wasn't even born in, it just makes me feel things. I'm not going to win any writing awards for that line, but there's just such a nostalgic universal appeal of the 1980s. Some of the stuff they say, the technology of the era, it just makes me reflect on my own childhood in the 1990s. Whenever the setting is in Amaguchi's room with his, at the time, cutting edge technology, I can't help but fall into a bit of ennui and reminisce on how things used to be. Another type of visual treat that people expect of Vanillaware games is fan service. Booba. I was quite surprised how little of it there was in the game. Only Morimura, the teacher, was constantly in a TNA pose with big baps. Everyone else was pretty free of it. Some people take issue with the characters being naked in the Sentinels, but I never really felt it was a sexualised event. They happened to be naked, but it was never really for titillation, and barring two characters, the poses are quite modest. The graphics in the RTS sections are, okay. At first I was a little surprised at the direction. It's so low-fi in comparison to the rest of the game. Nonetheless, it did the job and it never really detracted from the experience for me personally. I do get why some people think it looks bad from a glance. In the heat of the moment I wasn't bothered, but I can only imagine how it looks to someone who is watching it on YouTube with no context. Speaking of the gameplay, I was kinda dreading the RTS sections honestly. It's not a genre I've ever really thrown myself into, and as my primary goal was just finding out about the story, it seemed like it'd be a bit of a detriment. Surprisingly, I ended up getting quite into it. I expected to be overloaded with information, but it's actually quite deceptively simple. You're well tutorialised on how everything functions near the start of the game, and you're given a clear rundown on your characters and their purpose. The 13 mechs are separated into 4 categories, 1st through 4th generations. First prioritise close quarters combat, second are a bit of a mix of generations, third are long range, and fourth serve a more support oriented role. The Daimos similarly have different classes. Some are resistant to brute force, some can't be hit by ground units, etc. The difference in Daimos spawns forces you to use your cast in equal measure and not simply use your favourite 6 characters and get them ludicrously overpowered. The game also gives you a cooldown limit to prevent you cheesing the game in that way. After 2 battles, the mental strain in a character will become too much and you'll have to sit out a battle to recover. The game starts off quite simple and gradually ramps up. It's never too tricky, but when you unlock stronger moves, it infamously has poor frame rate. I fired off 4 missile strikes in a row in one mission near the end of the game, and my PS4 was chugging harder than I do when I see Ica. The midpoint level and the finale are incredibly satisfying standouts in the real-time strategy sections, and tied into the story perfectly. It really was such a fantastic game though, I can't recommend it enough. It's coming to Switch soon, and I hope a PC port follows, because I don't want this amazing game to fall into obscurity. If you're still here, thanks for watching. I'd also like to give an extra thanks to those who supported me in making this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next year. Maybe.
See you, chump.